Hey folks, just finished some yogurt and revitalized, and going to try to record a few things, starting with a little bit of info on the 1980s, rounding out period 9. Get it over with and done. Okay, so topic is the 1980s. For many people in the United States, the late 70s were a troubled and troubling time. The radical and countercultural movements of the 1960s and early 1970s, the Watergate scandal and Nixon, the Vietnam War, uncertainty in the Middle East, and economic crisis at home had undermined Americans' confidence in their fellow citizens and in their government. By the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency, the idealistic dreams of the 1960s were worn down by inflation, foreign policy turmoil, and rising crime at home. In response, many Americans embraced a new conservatism in social, economic, and political life during the 1980s. It was characterized by the policies of President Ronald Reagan. Often remembered for its materialism and consumerism, the decade also saw the rise of the yuppie, an explosion of blockbuster movies, and the emergence of cable networks like MTV, which introduced the music video and launched the careers of many iconic artists. Can't figure out how to do my head. Anyway, in the 1980s, there was a rise of the New Right, the populist conservative movement known as the New Right. It enjoyed an unprecedented growth in the 1970s and early 1980s. It appealed to a diverse assortment of Americans, including evangelical Christians, anti-tax crusaders, advocates of deregulation and smaller markets, advocates of a more powerful American presence abroad, disaffected white liberals, and defenders of an unrestricted free market. Did you know? At the beginning of the decade, as the Cold War showed no signs of warming, clever, huh? Arms control advocates argued for a nuclear freeze agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1982, almost 1 million people rallied in support of the freeze in New York City's Central Park. Many historians believe that this was the largest mass demonstration in American history. Historians link the rise of this new right in part to the growth of the so-called Sun Belt, a mostly suburban and rural region of the Southeast, Southwest, and California, where the population began to expand after World War II and exploded during the 1970s. This demographic shift had important consequences. Many of the new Sunbelters had migrated from older industrial cities of the North and Midwest, the Rust Belt now because its factories were rusting over. They did so because they had grown tired of the seemingly unsurmountable problems facing aging cities, such as overcrowding, pollution, and crime. Perhaps most of all, they were tired of having to pay higher taxes for social programs they did not consider effective and were worried about the stagnating economy. Many were also frustrated by what they saw as the federal government's constant, costly, and inappropriate interference. The movement resonated with many citizens who had once supported more liberal policies, but who no longer believed the Democratic Party represented their interest. So we see a switch. The 1980s, the Reagan Revolution, and Reaganomics. During and after the 1980 presidential election, These disaffected liberals came to be known as Reagan Democrats. They provided millions of crucial votes for the Republican candidate, the personable and engaging former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who died in 2004, in his victory over the incumbent Democratic President Jimmy Carter, still alive and being very helpful. Reagan won 51% of the vote and carried all but 5 states and the District of Columbia. Once a Hollywood actor, his outwardly reassuring disposition and optimistic style appealed to many Americans. Reagan was affectionately nicknamed the Gipper for his 1940 film role as a Notre Dame football player named George Gipper. Reagan's campaign cast a wide net, appealing to conservatives of all stripes, with promises of big tax cuts and smaller government. Once he took office, he set about making good on his promises to get the federal government out of Americans' lives and pocketbooks. He advocated for industrial deregulation, reductions in government spending, and tax cuts for both individuals and corporations as part of an economic plan he and his advisors referred to as supply-side economics. Rewarding success and allowing people with money to keep more of it, the thinking would encourage them to buy more goods and invest in businesses. The resulting economic growth would trickle down to everyone. Didn't happen. The 1980s, Reagan and the Cold War. Like many other American leaders during the Cold War, President Reagan believed that the spread of communism anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. As a result, his administration was eager to provide financial and military aid to anti-communist governments and insurgencies around the world. This policy, applied in nations including Grenada, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, was known as the Reagan Doctrine. So he's fighting communism anywhere, Reagan Doctrine. In November 1986, it emerged that the White House had secretly sold arms to Iran in an effort to win the freedom of U.S. hostages in Lebanon, and then diverted money from the sales to Nicaraguan rebels known as the Contras. The Iran-Contra affair, as it became known, resulted in the convictions, later reversed, of Reagan's National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, and Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a member of the National Security Council. Let's talk about Reaganomics in the 80s. On the domestic front, Reagan's economic policies initially proved less successful than its partisans had hoped, particularly when it came to a key tenet of the plan, balancing the budget. Huge increases in military spending during the Reagan administration. Pentagon spending would reach $34 million an hour, and they were not offset by spending cuts or tax increases elsewhere. By early 1982, the United States was experiencing its worst recession since the Great Depression. 9 million people were unemployed. In November of that year, businesses closed, families lost their homes, and farmers lost their land. The economy slowly righted itself, however, and Reaganomics grew popular again. Even the stock market crash of October 1987 did little to undermine the confidence of middle-class and wealthy Americans in the president's economic agenda. Many also overlooked the fact that Reagan's policies created record budget deficits. In his 8 years in office, the federal government accumulated more debt than it had in its entire history. Despite its mixed track record, a majority of Americans still believed in the conservative agenda by the late 1980s. When Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, he had the highest approval rating of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. In 1988, Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, soundly defeated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis in the presidential election. Let's talk about pop culture during the 1980s. In some respects, the pop culture of the 1980s reflected the era's political conservatism. For many people, the symbol of the decade was the yuppie, a baby boomer with a college education, a well-paying job, and expensive taste. Many people derided yuppies for being self-centered and materialistic, and surveys of young urban professionals across the country showed that they were indeed more concerned with making money and buying consumer goods than their parents and grandparents had been before them. However, in some ways, yuppiedom was less shallow and superficial than it appeared. Popular television shows like 30-something, I watched that one, that was a good one, and movies like The Big Chill and Bright Lights, Big City depicted a generation of young men and women who were plagued with anxiety and self-doubt. They were successful, but they weren't sure they were happy. At the movie theater, the 1980s was the age of the blockbuster. Movies like E.T., Home Home, The Extraterrestrial, The Return of the Jedi, Raiders of the Lost Ark, actually so very cool, and Beverly Hills Cop appealed to moviegoers of all ages and made hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. The 1980s was also the heyday of the teen movies. Films like The Breakfast Club and Some Kind of Wonderful and Pretty in Pink are still popular today. At home, people watch family sitcoms like The Cosby Show and Family Ties, Roseanne, and Married with Children. They also rented movies to watch on their new VCRs. By the end of the 1980s, 60% of American television owners got cable service, and the most revolutionary cable network of all was MTV, which made its debut August 1st, 1981. The music videos the network played made stars out of bands like Duran Duran and Culture Club, and made megastars out of the likes of Michael Jackson, whose elaborate Thriller video helped to sell 600,000 albums in 5 days after its first broadcast. MTV also influenced fashion. People across the country and around the world did their best to copy the hairstyles and fashions they saw in music videos. In this way, artists like Madonna became and remain fashion icons. I don't see that, but anyway. As the decade wore on, MTV also became a forum for those who went against the grain or were left out of the yuppie ideal. Rap artists such as Public Enemy channeled the frustration of urban African Americans into their powerful album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. Heavy metal acts such as Metallica and Guns N' Roses also captured the sense of malaise among young people, particularly young men. Even as Reagan maintained his popularity, popular culture continued to be an arena for dissatisfaction and debate throughout the 1980s.